and welcome back to another video. Today we are doing a book review, and it's a video I kind of actually don't really want to do, but it is of Queering the Tarot by Cassandra Snow. Of course it is Pride Month, so happy Pride Month. Black Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter, fuck JK Rowling and fuck TERFs. That just needed to be said, but let's get back to the review. Now this is the book that I read along with my Blossom Book Club in the month of May. Now I have to give you a warning that this is not a wholly positive review. I have some quite strong opinions and disagreements with the way some things were tackled in this book. And to be perfectly honest, I feel a little bit bad making this video, especially during Pride Month. But I do feel like this book has so many positive reviews, which is great. I'm so glad so many people have found themselves in a book. But there are some perspectives that I haven't seen spoken about, and I think people deserve to know what's in here so they can make informed decisions about whether this is a book for them. So this book actually started out as a blog series over on Little Red Tarot, and it certainly does read like a blog post in a lot of ways. The language is very, very easy, conversational to get into, which is lovely. It's set up in the way that a lot of tarot books are, like we have an introduction, a foreword by Beth Maiden, and then also the author discusses a little bit about the intention of the book, which is great to kind of frame our discussion. And then each and every card gets a couple of pages discussion, although an interesting thing to note is that some of the cards Cassandra has chosen to group together in the discussion. So for example, the Emperor and Empress are spoken about as like a pairing, and cards like the 2, 3, 4 of Swords spoken about together, which is actually something when I first realized that that was in here, I was not looking forward to that. I did not like the idea of it. I was concerned that the author was going to kind of like lump sort of similar cards in together. But instead what I found is that it really allowed her to break apart how those cards are similar, but also how they're different. Often, especially with the minor arcana, she would frame these grouped cards as kind of like different stages in a journey, which is something we hear about in discussions around tarot quite often. But having it framed in this way in the book was actually something I grew to quite appreciate. My favorite part of this book though was probably actually the introduction. I loved the introduction, and it actually made me quite emotional reading it. Basically, for some context, I am bi or pansexual. I don't mind either label. But because I have been in a monogamous long-term relationship with a cis-het man, I often feel like that part of my identity has been erased by both me and society. It's something that I've kind of detached from to an extent, which makes me a bit sad to say. And that's my own stuff to work through. Basically, I don't always feel like I qualify as queer enough. But why I loved this introduction so much is because in the introduction, Cassandra makes it super clear that this book is for everybody, and that every letter of the LGBTQ+ family is as equally important in her eyes and is included in the intention of this book. It made me really super emotional. I felt very validated, very seen, and so right from the get-go I was so excited about this book, and I felt like this book was for me. And I think that that feeling that I got from the introduction is something that a lot of people probably experience throughout this book, and that is something I do not want to undersell in a world where so many people are underrepresented or not represented at all. And I mean this in terms of both the like wider society, but also in terms of the tarot world, the tarot community, which as far as I'm concerned is not doing well enough as far as representation and authentic representation is concerned, both in terms of the imagery in our decks, the way we talk about our decks, the creators we support, all of it. And so that is the context for this book, and it's hugely important. Something else I really enjoyed about this book was I just felt like there were kind of, you know, one-off sentences or one-liners that really struck me with so many of the cards that just stood out as like highlighting perfectly a card, or really kind of bringing to the foreground something really important about a card, whatever. I'll read you a few examples. The first one, right at the beginning, was with the Fool. Cassandra says, "This one is special because we aren't starting a new chapter, we're starting a totally new book." For the Strength card, she says, "More often than not, strength comes to affirm our worth and power in this world. The lessons of the Strength card are not complicated to explain, but they are very difficult to internalize and accept." And the final line for the Death card reads, "Death does not prescribe the right or proper way to grieve. It insists patiently only that we do grieve." Another thing I really appreciated about this book and the author's approach was that she would very often kind of just admit quite openly when she did not like a card. And I personally found this so refreshing, because I do feel like in the tarot space there's very often this drive to rehabilitate negative cards. Common examples are like the Ten of Swords, or just the sword suit in general, let's be real, or cards like the Emperor and the Hierophant. And the Hierophant, in fact, is one of those cards for Cassandra, and I just loved how upfront she was about that and just honest. The first line in the Hierophant description reads, "Full disclosure, I'm not a fan of the Hierophant at all." She then goes on to explain what the card means to her, how it comes up in readings, and then she says, "If you have a negative view of any card, you do not always have to spend the card positively." And I totally agree with that. So I really appreciated this, that she made it clear that the Hierophant is not inherently a negative card, but to her it does represent a lot of shitty things. And she makes no apologies for that. Another thing I like about this book is that Cassandra kind of walks through what the card means and then the process of querying it, what it could mean for a queer querent or if we're reading for ourselves. And then she also very often gives very specific examples of what this card might mean in a reading. Now, I want to talk about some things that I liked less about this book, and there are a number of criticisms I have, and I'm going to mention some of them briefly. However, there is one thing that was ultimately a deal breaker for me, and is something that I feel like I can talk personally about, like I can speak personally to, given my lived experience. So I am going to focus on that. But let me first just mention a few things I struggled with. The first thing that I noticed was that this book is full of generalizations. In particular, the queer experience that Cassandra is very often referring to. And that is of somebody growing up in perhaps an oppressive family environment or community environment, later coming out, kind of maybe having to move towns, and then finding their queer family. Like, it's a very specific sort of journey that many queer people go on, but not all do. I'll just give you one example. This is on page 101. She says, "Queer relationships are a little more intense emotionally, both because our dating pool is thinner and because we spend so long in the closet not honoring our emotions." That is a very, very specific experience about queer relationships and the journey of a queer person in their life that is spoken about as if it's just something all queer people have in common. And I also think it's worth pointing out that this queer narrative of like the coming out story is not only, I think, specific to some people, it's also quite culturally specific, and I just don't feel like the author had a very strong awareness of that. Something else that I struggled with this book was just how American-centric it is. And of course, she's American, so she lives in America, that's her context. What bothers me more specifically about it is just, again, there was a lack of insight and self-awareness. Some examples include when she's talking about the state of our country, and also, you know, the 2016 election, as if lots of other countries didn't also have very significant elections in 2016. And so I think not only will that make this book date quite quickly, more to the point, I think that lack of self-awareness that she says in the introduction that this book is for everybody. And yet it's so culturally specific, it's so specific to a location. And I understand that she cannot like reference and cover every experience across the globe. That's not what I'm asking. Instead, what I'm asking is just that authors demonstrate a little bit of self-awareness when they're saying that. Instead of saying our country or the election, say in my country or in America or in the American, like, you know what I mean? Just specify what you're talking about instead of assuming that your audience shares your experience, basically. So I had some criticisms, particularly around the generalizations and the lack of self-awareness perhaps around some of the language that was used were my kind of main ones, but I was still very much on board with the intention of this book and the purpose of it, which is to kind of break open some of these cards and make us question some of our assumptions and to represent a community that is so underrepresented both in society and in the tarot world. But then we get to a point in the book, in the Suit of Swords, that it was ultimately, I don't know how else to say this, it was a deal breaker for me. It was just the nail in the coffin that means that I do not feel comfortable personally recommending this book. And so my big problem is on page 100, and it is in reference to the 2 and 3 of Swords. So she describes the 2 of Swords as being a card that indicates that we need to take a leap of faith, which is interesting. I've never heard that description of the 2 of Swords before, but you know, fair enough. But my problem begins, let me just read you this bit and then we can talk about it. Though this card often requires leaping first and looking later, if it's showing up in a placement or a way that screams behavior and not advice, you're likely looking at someone who struggles with manic episodes common in bipolar disorder. In those situations, the guidance you'd see from a tarot reader should be very different and should caution one away from actually taking leaps of faith right now. The 3 of Swords, however, is frequently a clear indication of severe depression cycling back to a very dark state. You can look at the 2 and 3 of Swords cards together and see a bipolar querent. You can look at them separately and see anxiety in the 2 and depression in the 3. In either case, it's critical to remember that the seeker cannot control those cycles or those highs and lows. The card can serve as very effective warnings to the seeker to look out for relapse and can provide the reader more information about the very real obstacles facing the seeker. However, tarot readers are not therapists, and the advice that comes with these cards should include traditional approaches like therapy and medication to deal with these swings. Let me let you in on a little secret before I get into this. I've actually already filmed and edited and uploaded and scheduled this video earlier this week, but I ended up ranting so much and watching it back, I felt like I came across very mean. And even though I want to own the fact that this legitimately does make me angry, I think it's inappropriate and I want to explain to you why. And I want to honor like how strongly I do feel about this. I also don't want to come across like I'm trying to attack the author, because that is not at all my intention. So my primary problem with this is the use of clinical language. To me, it's just wholly inappropriate in a tarot reading and a book about tarot. I'm fine with the way that she was discussing depression and anxiety because those are not diagnoses. Like anybody can and probably has experienced feelings of depression and anxiety. Anxiety and depression are normal human emotions that, yes, vary widely on a big scale or spectrum. But the way that she talks about and specifies the mania of bipolar disorder, to me, is entirely inappropriate and makes me really uncomfortable. Firstly, a lot of people won't actually know what mania is. So her assumption that the reader will understand what she's trying to mean, I think is flawed. And mania is, of course, a name that we give a certain mood state for people with bipolar, but it is not very specific. If I tell you that I had a manic episode, you will have no idea really what I actually experienced in that manic episode. Yes, you might be able to take a guess at like vaguely what I got up to and how I was feeling, but the mania of bipolar disorder is it's a big spectrum and it's experienced by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. I think what the author here is trying to get at is the recklessness and impulsivity that can come along with mania. And so basically, I just wish she'd said that instead. And if you're going to talk about something like recklessness, impulsivity, bad decision making, whatever, that's all like useful, tangible things that you can discuss in a tarot reading setting. And not only that, but it doesn't have to just apply to someone with a diagnosis. So ultimately, I just do not understand the choice to specify bipolar here, and I don't agree with the choice to do so. And the idea that you can look at the 2 and 3 of Swords cards together and see a bipolar querent, when on average it takes us 10 years to get diagnosed. It's really presumptive and I think dangerous. And the way that this author describes her own approach to tarot very much comes across like her purpose as a tarot reader is to help people and empower them. And I don't understand how including bipolar, specifying bipolar in this way, is at all helpful to anyone. Because like I said, it's not specific enough about a particular experience or behavior that we could discuss, but it's also hugely generalizing about a particular illness in a way that does not demonstrate an understanding of the diverse experience of bipolar. And yes, of course, as someone with bipolar, I do have cards that represent symptoms and things that I experience associated with my bipolar disorder. But there is no way that I would ever presume to use those meanings in a professional tarot reading setting. And I know that some of you will probably think that I'm making a big deal out of like 2 paragraphs, and I get that. But the fact that it was so short and kind of quick is almost what makes me more mad and frustrated, because it feels flippant. It feels disrespectful. It feels like it has not taken seriously the weight of an illness like bipolar. Basically, she doesn't take the time to demonstrate any boundaries that might make this discussion appropriate. She doesn't take the time to give us any disclaimers about how and when and where this might be appropriate. About the only disclaimer she sort of gives is towards the end here when she says, however, tarot readers are not therapists. And I wholly agree, which is why I wrote down here underneath, so why the fuck are we even talking about clinical diagnoses? Now, this second part that I read out to you regarding the traditional approaches like therapy and medication, I also had a problem with. Now, I personally am very pro meds and therapy. Like, they've done wonders for me, and I know that they've done wonders for a lot of people. And I'm also very pro the normalization of those things. But the way this is described, that the advice that comes with these cards should include traditional approaches like therapy and medication. I don't think that's appropriate. One is a running theme throughout this book is that is very culturally specific. Therapy and medication is one response to the symptoms of bipolar disorder, and it is a very Western one. Also, it sounds a little bit too much like a reader opening up the discussion about the treatment plan of someone with a diagnosable clinical illness. And for me, that's just crossing some very, very hard ethical lines. I suppose if any of you have been here with me for a while, I don't know if you've seen, I think I might have actually deleted it now, but anyway, I did a video several years ago about the schizophrenia card in the Osho Zen Tarot. And I spoke about how personally I had grown to understand that card in a way that was really powerful for me, but I hugely disagreed with the choice to name it schizophrenia. And I thought that it was problematic and dangerous. And that ultimately I wish that they'd kind of kept the feeling of that card and the imagery, but instead of using a clinical term like schizophrenia, they'd instead chosen to use something more specific to what they were actually trying to say. So my argument was not that the card itself was wrong. My argument was that it's inappropriate to use that language. And in fact, using more specific non-clinical language could be a lot more useful to a lot more people, including people that might identify with that illness. I feel very similarly about this. Use words that actually describe what you mean instead of just sticking a label on it that I don't think the author has demonstrated a strong awareness or understanding of in this book. And I know personally that I felt a lot of sadness in reading this book and putting up this review, because ultimately I do feel like this is an important book, and I feel as if I should be standing in solidarity with this book, its intention, and with the author, especially when the tarot community is still doing such a poor job of authentic and powerful representation. But I do also feel a responsibility to myself and to others like me who are queer and bipolar. And I know there's many of you. I feel a responsibility to have these challenging discussions and to push the communities that I'm in to reconsider the way that we talk about mental illness and specific diagnoses. So as I said, I had many criticisms of this book, but I could also appreciate what it was trying to do, and in many cases what it was successfully achieving. And yes, obviously the bipolar stuff is something that is really personal to me, and for some people it might be something that you can kind of gloss over. But as a queer person, I did not appreciate having something that is so integral to me and my lived experience presented in such a flippant way that is potentially, I think, quite harmful. Like I said though, I do think that this is an important book. My hope though is that this is the beginning of a conversation, or one part of an ongoing conversation. And the only way we can kind of improve and develop better language and be more inclusive and understanding and break down some stigma and assumptions and generalizations is if people like me talk about stuff like this. Obviously, I feel very strongly about this and I'm hugely passionate about this topic, but I do hope that I've managed to convey a reasonably balanced and respectful review. So as I said, I read this book along with my Blossom Book Club over on my Patreon and Discord server, and I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of you who participated in this discussion. It was really, really helpful in me kind of better understanding and also validating my feelings around this book, because I sort of felt like a bit of an asshole. So it was great just kind of having you guys express your love and some of what you were disappointed about, but also just helping me better understand where my emotions were coming from. And of course, while I'm on the topic, I have to thank all of my patrons over on Patreon for your ongoing support. And in particular, a big extra special thank you goes to Tracy Timmerman, Laurie, Lynette Brown, and the Hales K. And of course, a big thank you to you for watching this video. I hope that whether you enjoyed or loved this book or not, I hope I've given you some food for thought. I hope I've done so in a respectful way, and I will talk to you all in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. So much love. Bye.